The ball lightning Sorc in Diablo 4 is absolutely ridiculous right now. It does insane boss damage. It has practically infinite evades once you get the Oculus set up, and you can just move around Hell Tides and Nightmare Dungeons and Whispers super duper quickly, just murdering everything. And once you have the build set up, you practically don't even need to worry about mana at all. You have no generators or anything. You're just spamming ball lightning, becoming an absolute machine of death. In this video guide, we're going to go through everything you need to know to get started with the build. There is a written guide on the Mobilex website. You can find a link to that in the description down below. So why ball lightning, and why is it considered overpowered this season? Well, season 2, they basically redid the damage formula and they changed a whole bunch of stuff. But one thing that they did with ball lightning is you can see here that right now it's ticking at rank 8 for about 102% damage. Last season, this number at about the same rank was like 16%. So for some reason, they just drastically increased the damage of ball lightning and is just incredibly strong. Ball lightning also scales extremely well with attack speed. You can see that first modifier right up here. The damage rate is increased by 200% of your attack speed bonus. And you can get attack speed from vampire powers and from your gloves and from accelerating aspect. And this just really gives you a lot of extra damage. And then when ball lightning hits an enemy at least 4 times, a crackling energy is formed 2 times per cast. And so this is giving us even more mana back. But let's go through all of the ways that we're dealing with mana. We're using Prodigy's aspect. It makes it so that when you use a cooldown, you're going to restore your mana, and almost everything on your bar is a cooldown. So this helps restore your mana. And this is also on the codec. We're also going to be using Flame Shield with the Mystical Flame Shield. This makes it so that while Flame Shield is up, we get a mana cost reduction, which is pretty big for us because it allows us just to pump out ball lightnings in safety. I mentioned crackling energy before. Well, every time we pick up a crackling energy, we're going to gain 12 mana back in return. Each ball lightning is going to generate 2 crackling energies, which means 24 mana is coming back to us. And ball lightning has a base cost around 50 mana. So almost half of the mana cost of ball lightning is already being refunded to us. Now we're also using chain lightning enchantment. Is when we spend 100 mana, chain lightning is going to shoot out. It has increased critical strike chance whenever it bounces, but our crit strike chance is already extremely high. And then when chain lightning critically strikes, it has a 30% chance to form a crackling energy. So there's even more crackling energy on the ground there. And we're going to be auto casting this basically every 2 or so ball lightnings, which just makes keeping this going really, really easy. We're also using in our Paragon trait, Static Surge. After spending 100 mana, your next cast of Chain Lightning or Charged Volks makes enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds and restores 10% of your mana. I'm up to 150 mana now because I'm getting it on my hat, I'm getting it from my pants, I'm getting it from Paragon, and so this is giving me back 15 mana. Now, when you're first starting off, you can take this whole chain lightning thing even to another level, and you can use the recharging aspect. This makes it so that each time chain lightning bounces, you're going to gain 1.5 to 3 mana. This is also on the codex, especially early on when you're like, mana's not all that great. This is very noticeable, and I use this for a little bit, but in endgame, we're not going to need this at all because we're just going to have so much mana. And then, of course, we're using mana cost reduction. We're using mana generation on our gear. Just getting willpower in general will give us more mana generation. And all of this kind of helps come together. Now, eventually, we're going to have the pants Tybalt's Will. These have maximum resource on them, which is just more mana. But on top of that, its special effect makes it so that you deal increased damage while you're unstoppable and for 4 seconds afterwards. And then when you become unstoppable, you gain 50 of your primary resource, which is just a lot of mana. And then that's multiplied by a resource generation. We're becoming unstoppable rather frequently. Teleporting makes you unstoppable. Flame Shield makes you unstoppable. And thanks to vampire powers, we're going to use Metamorphosis so that each evade will turn us unstoppable as well. And it basically turns us into an unstoppable ball lightning machine. Now, I know what you're thinking. This all sounds great, but what do I need to get started with this build? you don't really need almost anything at all. I've gone through and I played this build as soon as I could get ball lightning while leveling up, and it was not that bad. Now, without the gravitational aspect, which makes it so that your ball lightnings rotate around yourself, it is a little bit rougher. And it can be a little bit harder to generate those crackling energies, especially if your attack speed is low. So getting this does help. And the best way to get gravitational aspect is just to gamble offhands. So take those obols that you're getting, slam them into offhands. If you're doing PvP stuff, you can gamble on gloves. And once you get this aspect and the mana aspects that I mentioned before, it's going to feel actually pretty smooth. We went through and we did our capstone dungeons, and it was really quite easy this season. And I managed to go and kill Uber Lilith for the very first time ever solo at level 76. And then I went and just killed Uber Duriel at level 77, and it was relatively easy. This build is absolutely overtuned for the available content right now, and is just a lot of fun to play. Let's quickly talk about the skills. So we're using Ball Lightning, obviously. Teleport and Flame Shield are just standards in every single Sorc build. One to move around, one to become invincible. We're getting mana cost reduction here as well. This is also going to make it so that whenever we teleport, crackling energy is going to hit more enemies, which is important. Unstable Currents is our ultimate. This is going to make it so that we're just blasting off more skills. We also get more attack speed, and it's going to make our crackling energy pulse faster with no charges used. And this is going to activate our overflowing energy a whole bunch, which makes it so that whenever crackling energy hits an enemy, the cooldown on all of your shock skills is reduced, which just kind of like compounds everything and makes your cooldowns really come back quickly. Lastly, I like the conjuration version of this build. Ice Blades reduces all of your cooldowns, and then Lightning Spear is just another cooldown that'll be reduced by your keystone. These both count for conjuration mastery, which gives us 3% increased damage for each active conjuration. And the way this is showing up is all damage. But it's weird because this is actually getting multiplied by other sources. So at 16.5, I conjure up, and you can see that we go all the way up to 123. Which is quite a bit more than 3%. And so this is incredibly strong as you're self-casting these, getting them out, and is getting those cooldowns as short as possible, because all damage is its own separate damage bucket. Lastly, for the enchantments, we already talked about Chain Lightning enchantment. More Chain Lightnings going off is more crackling energy, is more procs of Static Surge, but then Firebolt also allows us to make everything burn, which allows us to use Devouring Blaze, and allows us to use the Paragon board, Burning Instincts. We're not going to take the legendary node. Everything else here is really good for fighting enemies that are burning. Now, I've had a lot of people ask me why we don't use either Frost Nova or Ice Armor in this build, and I just don't think that it's really necessary. So the reason that you used to always pack Frost Nova, despite it having an insanely long cooldown, is because it applied Vulnerable. Now we have other ways to apply Vulnerable, even just evading through enemies will apply Vulnerable, and with our teleport stunning, thanks to our unique chest armor, Raiment of the Infinite, which you can farm off of Varshan, this is pretty much going to take the place of Frost Nova in the build. Likewise, Ice Armor just provides a shield that is kind of refillable, but it's not even all that big of a shield. It's 30% of your base HP, whereas this just using any cooldown will give you 30% of your maximum HP. And I just think that this is more impactful for you. Now, if you're looking to go even more defensive with the build, maybe like you're struggling through pushing like tier 100 or something, these might be some okay options. But I currently think that the conjuration version of this is just a lot more damage and just is fun. All right, Paragon board. So we're going to be putting Flame Feeder in the first board here. This is just a nice glyph to make us do more damage to every enemy that we're already hitting. Next, we're moving up to the Burning Instincts board. This is a great board for doing damage to and taking less damage from burning enemies. It's the perfect home for our Destruction glyph. This does way too much damage right now, 163% critical strike damage at level 17. This thing just is a huge number for us because we always crit. We're like at 100% chance to crit, so we're taking extreme advantage of this multiplier. Next, we're moving up to the Static Surge board. I'm going to go get our legendary node up here for more mana and some vulnerable. And then this is where the Adept glyph is going to live. Now note, this glyph will not work in this spot until you've leveled it to level 15. So this should be your first glyph to level up to 15. And you can just put this in the starter board until you're ready for that. Don't forget to get the mana over here. Very important, so we can stay above 100 mana as much as possible for the Elementalist aspect. And then we're going over to the Frigid Fate board. This legendary node is not very good because we don't have any bonus to cold damage. And we're just going to slap exploit in here. This glyph has really fallen down in this particular season, so we're not really going to be powering this up at all. And we're just going to get some damage reduction and damage on this board, some free cold resistance, and move on to Ceaseless Conduit. Crackling Energy is not really part of our damage profile, so we're not going to get this. This is mostly just so we can run in, drop our territorial glyph, and then move on. This is just a very good glyph for the damage reduction and some increased damage as well. Lastly, we're coming over to Icefall, and we're not really going to be taking advantage of the damage 2 or damage reduction from chilled enemies, but this is just a place for us to throw charged in, because this gives us an additional 15% more damage. Next, let's talk about gear. So for helmet, you're going to want cooldown reduction, mana, life, and resistance. This is just perfect hat. And then I recommend the disobedience aspect because it's going to help you with physical damage. For body armor, until you have Raiment of the Infinite, you can just use any chest that has defensive stuff on it, and you can throw any defensive aspect into it like Ever Living. And then next up, we have gloves, which is a super important source of both attack speed and critical strike chance. And you can also get like lucky hit here. You can get some stats, and this is just a very important piece of gear to get. I have accelerating on here, which will automatically proc once our chain lightning is getting procced by spending 100 mana. For pants, until you have Tybalt's Will, I highly recommend just defensive set of pants with any defensive aspect on it. And then here, I'm really looking at like the damage reduction and the multiplier damage in the special effect, but the maximum resource is also pretty important. And even the damage here goes into your all damage bucket, which is very nice. For boots, normally I would recommend having the +3 evade boots. However, as you can see here, we have the attacks reduce evades cooldown by 1.2 seconds boots. And the reason I'm doing this is because in my weapon slot, I'm using the Oculus. Now the Oculus, what it normally does is it turns your evade into a teleport where you go teleporting all over the place randomly. However, thanks to Metamorphosis, which changes our evade into a cloud of bats, that supersedes the Oculus's effect. So we can basically just evade wherever we want without having the downside of the Oculus. This also means that with these boots and the Oculus's thing, we can have our evade just continuously resetting super duper fast, and we don't really need to ever slow down. And especially as you're collecting crackling energy from killing enemies, this allows you just to zoom around Helltide like you have a mount, but you're not on a mount. Where we're going, we don't need mounts sometimes. And then you might notice that in the armor here, we are using the ruby gems. This is just the best way to increase your maximum life right now. If you're having trouble with damage over time, you can switch to amethyst. For weapon gems, I highly recommend going with emeralds. They're still just the best. And if you don't have the Oculus yet, I'd look for a high item power weapon like 925s come off the world boss. And then you're looking for critical strike damage, vulnerable damage, mastery skill damage, damage to burning enemies, and then you can use the conceited aspect, which will increase the amount of damage you do while you have a barrier, and you're getting barriers from using every single cooldown. For offhand, I have gravitational aspect on here. You want this to be as high a number as possible. This is what makes your ball lightning rotate around you as opposed to flying off into the universe. And for offhand, you can get like mana cost reduction, you get resource generation, you get cooldown. Critical strike chance is pretty important here, so you can hit that 100% critical strike. And then I have a lucky hit chance to restore primary resource. I think I rolled this to like 3 million gold. And yeah, this is just what I have. I would also recommend on boots that you have movement speed, mana cost reduction, and then ranks of stuff. Teleport is pretty nice, especially if you're using the Oculus. Obviously here we don't have mana cost, which is kind of unfortunate. And even the lightning resist here is not bad because it's going to help us sort out resistances. For accessories on our necklace, it is kind of important to get ranks of mastery skills, cooldown reduction, you can get glass cannon or other passives that are good. You can get damage reduction here. And there's just a lot of different amulet variations out there, and finding one that's like good enough is probably going to be good enough for the build. And this is where we're going to put the elementalist aspect at max roll. That's going to make it so that you get 60% increased critical strike chance, which with my other stats would give me 100% chance to crit whenever we are above 100 mana. And seeing I have 150 mana, that's pretty frequently. For ring, critical strike chance is key. Then you want critical strike damage, and then any other sorts of damage like vulnerable damage is fine, damage to close, damage to burning. Resource generation here is also pretty good. And you even can get lightning critical strike damage. Now, I do want to note that lightning critical strike damage is inherently worse than having critical strike damage for a weird thing. So right now, as you can see here, I have 31.5% lightning critical strike damage. Well, my other sources of critical strike damage are actually getting multiplied by a couple things. One by Devouring Blaze, and then I think just inherently. So 374 critical strike damage. And if I take off this ring, which is 23.3, this should drop it down to 41.1, but instead it drops it down to 39.5. So this is a little bit extra critical strike damage that's coming down. And I think I actually did the math wrong there. It should be 51.1. So this is kind of noticeable. There's an extra multiplier on critical strike damage. And so especially since we have 100% chance to crit, getting critical strike damage on our gear will give us a lot of power. I'm using the Storm Swell aspect. This gives you increased vulnerable damage while you have a barrier, which is anytime we use a cooldown. And this actually multiplies your vulnerable damage. You can notice here that it went from 166 to 243. So this makes vulnerable damage another good stat on our gear. Last but not least, let's talk about vampire powers this season. So first off, let's talk about Ravenous. Ravenous is ridiculous and is definitely something that you want to pick up for the build. What this does is makes it so that you have increased your attack speed by 40% of your total movement speed for 6 seconds. The lucky hit on this will be going off all of the time. And so this is going to give us an additional 46.9 or higher movement speed to attack speed bonus. And this is just absolutely best in slot for ball lightning. Practically is doubling your damage at 50%. Next up, I have Prey on the Weak. Now this doesn't necessarily do very much for us right now by itself, but this does give us a multiplicative damage to vulnerable enemies, which is a very good thing. And it also makes it so that any enemy that's affected by a vampire curse from our other powers is also vulnerable, which comes along with Metamorphosis. This makes it so that when you evade, you turn into a cloud of bats, you become unstoppable, triggering Tybalt's Will to give us more damage and more resources. We do a little bit of damage, but we also inflict enemies with a vampiric curse. This power is incredibly powerful because this actually superimposes itself over top of the Oculus's effect of making you do a random teleport. And so if I took off this vampire power like so, my teleport would overtake my evade, and now we would have a teleport evade that would just take us on a random trip somewhere. And so that time I went there, but you can really end up almost anywhere as you teleport around randomly, and we don't want that because going to random places is not something that we want to do in our build. And so instead with the Metamorphosis, we teleport as a cloud of bats to exactly where we want to go, and is a very nice combination for us. Next up, Undying basically solves one of this build's biggest problems, which was the ability to recover a little bit of chip damage. Before, you pretty much had to use your health potion if you took like even 10% of your health or even got down pretty low, but this practically means that we're always healing up super duper fast. This is doubled when we're below half health, so we're healing for 6% of our health every time we cast, and we can cast a ton of ball lightnings and a ton of other spells very quickly, healing ourselves up. So even if you do take health damage, you are going to be blasting back to full health. Last but not least, we have the Anticipation power here, and this is basically just going to help your ultimate come off cooldown quicker. For me, this is about a 10-second reduction on the ultimate, which just gives us power, and when the ultimate's up, it feels really, really good. The other thing that I was using for quite a bit is Call Familiar, and this one makes it whenever you cast Ball Lightning, you do an additional little bat attack, which has a chance to stun, and I thought that this was pretty good, but I'm kind of liking the smoothness of Anticipation, maybe just a little bit more. I know there are some other powers in here that people have talked about, like Infection. I don't think is as good as the ones we have here, but you know, you can always mess around and try different stuff out for yourself. It's not very costly to change these around. And that's it for the build guide. I'm going to also put out a bonus little video about how to kill Uber Lilith with this particular build, because it took me a little bit to kind of figure out. And this was the very first time that I managed to kill Uber Lilith solo. And it was really easy, especially now that I'm geared up, not level 76. Uber Lilith is an absolute breeze. And so if that's something you've been trying to do for a while, this little video should help you out. Let me know if you guys have any questions in the comments below. Make sure you check out the Mobalytics written guide, and we'll see you guys in the stream. Peace.